Hello, welcome to the Surgical Assistant Podcast, a podcast crafted by surgical assistants for surgical assistants, where professionalism meets passion. Join us in fostering a strong, supportive community where unity among surgical assistants is celebrated and encouraged. Tune in to the Surgical Assistant and take your career to the next level. Hello, I'm Kelly. Welcome back to our second episode.
Hi, and I'm John.
Yeah, John, today, what is our discussion? It's going to be, we're talking about how to become a first assistant or how to get started as a first assistant. So today, our target audience would be if you have made a decision to become a first assistant, or if you are in a first assistant program currently, or finishing up a first assistant program currently. This episode is going to be for you. We're going to just run over some things to consider when starting your first assisting career. Does that sound about right?
Yes, exactly. So you've decided to become a first assistant. Now what? What's the next step you're going
Right.
to take?
Right.
If
Exactly.
you're somebody
Exactly.
somebody that has absolutely no clinical experience, well, then you're going to have to find a way in, and that usually is to become a surgical tech first. So our suggestion would be finding a surgical technology program, getting into it, becoming a surgical tech for a few years, and then you'll be at the point where most people who are listening to this podcast are, where they've been a surg tech for a few years and they want to move forward. They want more responsibility. They've worked with first assistants. They like what they do. They like more responsibility, the enhanced involvement in surgery, with the care of the patient. Now what?
Right. And that you mentioned becoming a scrub tech, and that's a whole point of discussion in and of itself.
True.
But I strongly recommend, like you, John, that you do have a clinical background specifically in the operating rooms, but not just for scrub techs,
Mm.
for RNs as well. I've worked with lots
Yes,
of
true.
circulators that have expressed an interest to me in becoming a first assistant and furthering their education and training. And I am all for that. So
Mhm.
whatever your background, if you've got that clinical and operating room experience, first assisting is a very viable next step for you in your career, I would say. Today, we're going to talk about starting that and where to go from here. I remember when I was starting my career, I just didn't realize there was a career of first assisting. I didn't know it existed. And this was in 2011, 2012, when I was researching. We hope to provide information for the listener, and we hope that this is going to help someone to decide what direction, where do you need to go once you make this decision, once you've been exposed to first assistants and first assisting, and you realize, hey, that's something I might be interested in. So, we're just going to start off talking about the programs, educational programs and schools that you need to look into and kind of research on your own, depending on where you live, the format of those programs, the cost of those programs, et cetera, and what fits your personal situation the best. And we found a great resource recently, didn't we, John?
Yes, we did. It's from the NSAA, the National Surgical Assistant Association, their
Mhm.
website. If you click under education, a comprehensive list of the 12 or 13, I'm not sure which, it's 12 or 13, of the KHEP accredited surgical assistant programs that you would need to graduate from in order to sit for the exam so you can become a surgical first assistant.
I was super impressed with what they had on their website just by going on there really quick. I found it very quickly after going onto their website. I was telling John when we were kind of researching this episode that when I put into Google, how do I become, or what did I tell you? I Googled how surgical first assistant programs or
Hmm.
something like that. The very first thing that popped up was a CST program. So a program for surgical technologists, which is not the same thing. So I kind of scrolled down and I saw an RNFA program, so I kinda kept going, and, like, the 3rd or 4th option down, I think it was the NSAA site,
Hmm.
and I clicked on that, and right there, it took me straight into a very good comprehensive list of the programs in the United States for first assisting. So, that's a great place to start, just kind of deciding which of those programs is good for you, and we are going to try to reach out to some directors from those programs,
Hmm.
aren't
Oh, yeah.
we?
I'd like to have one on
And
maybe each episode or every other episode as we reach out. And if they're willing to come on, just come on for 10 or 15 minutes and give us a brief rundown of their program, sets their program apart, what people
Mhm.
need to get into their program, the cost, the layout, how it works, that kind of thing. We'll see. It's evolving as
Right.
we go forward, but I'm going to reach out to those
Right.
people this week and hopefully line a few up. I'd like to get the 3 major schools that I know about and go from there. So,
If we can do that and provide that to people, that would be cool because I'm sure these directors will have obviously a wealth of information about their particular school and their particular program. And I think that'll be a win-win because it'll provide our listeners with information and it'll be good advertising for them. So
exactly.
hopefully we'll be able to line that up.
Point of clarification you brought up, it would take you a long time to find it. So I'm glad you brought
Mhm.
that up because I think Google, from what somebody told me, is based on advertising. Whoever pays gets put up first, and it can be
Yeah.
misleading. So I'm glad you did that so people can find the right resources that they need to get there.
Yeah.
So you were going to say?
Yeah, you kinda have to dig around, and most people listening to this podcast, I think, are going to have had some exposure to first assistance in the workplace. So, I know I never mind people asking me
Mhm.
questions about where I went to school, how I got started, and just asking me all the questions. I like to answer those questions and help people along as I can. I had people helping me along the way, and I appreciate it so much, all the help I got. You have to do a little bit of digging
Mhm.
for sure to find that information.
But I think in that situation now, you're much better off than I was because
Mhm.
when I wanted to go through it because it wasn't around. Depending on what part of the country you're in, some states don't recognize surgical first assistance, but for the most part, most states do nowadays. But I grew up in South Florida for the most part, and I did not know of any surgical first. I knew of one surgical first assistant when I became a surgical tech. This was back in the 90s, and it was very difficult. Now it's much more easy. So this is a good time to become a surgical first assistant. There's a lot of resources out there, and we want this podcast to be a resource. So I think it's a good time
Yes,
to
yes.
approach the profession.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. So we're gonna touch on just for the person that knows nothing about the educational track of becoming a first assistant, we're just gonna kinda touch on what we know.
Mhm.
These are going to be it's gonna be basic information and steps as far as the educational program that you and the format. I think of most programs, there's an academic portion. Thankfully, many of these can be done online. You purchase your textbooks, your texts, and you have reading assignments and tests and all that good stuff. So you have the academic portion, and then you have an applied lab portion. And the applied lab typically is where you go on site to your school and for a length of time, 1 week, 2 weeks, whatever it might be, for a length of time, you're there in a lab setting and primarily to learn didactic skills. So you're going to learn your suturing, your knot tying, ligating vessels, that kind of thing. I know in the program I went through, and I believe you too, John, we operated on live pigs, I think. And so you were getting experience working on live, living, breathing tissue, bleeding tissue, so that you can practice those skills in a lab setting. And then there was a written test at the end of that week, if I remember, that you have to take and pass, as well as passing just your hands-on part. And then the final part of that would be your clinicals. So the clinical part of this is we really want to kind of have a discussion here about your clinical training with the education part of this talk. Um, it's because that we see a lot of, and I had mentioned to John before starting recording, we see a lot of questions from people who are in a program or about to start a program. And there seem to be a lot of questions about lining up those clinical sites and how that kind of works. So again, I know that's going to vary from program to program and we can't speak to being experts on each individual program that's out there. However, I think it's our understanding that you do need to have a plan ahead of time how you're going to achieve your clinical cases and get credit for those. So you need a participating facility and you need a participating proctor, at least one proctor. I think ideally you want more than one surgeon or more than one FA that can proctor you along in your clinical cases. Does that sound about right, John?
It does. I know when speaking specifically to the program, we went through the same program, and they did, you're right, they had a didactic phase. Then they had the clinical skills lab where you had to travel to the school, like you mentioned. I know I'm repeating what you said. They wanna know before they allow you to do your clinicals at a hospital that you are competent, that you can tie
Right.
knots, that you can suture wounds
Mhm.
closed, because you should have a little bit of skill before you get there. And that is one good thing about the program. Like you mentioned, we operate on anesthetized pigs. You get to deal with real bleeding, real tissue. It gives you a leg up, I think. But all programs have benefits and merits. But yes, you do have to have an affiliation agreement with a hospital. I was lucky when I went through the program. I specifically applied at a hospital and I hashed that out in my interview. I said, listen, my plan is to become a surgical first assistant. Can I do my clinical
Okay.
site here? And they said yes. Everybody's situation is unique. Maybe your hospital doesn't allow that, or you don't have an affiliation agreement, but you can get one. There are people at the schools that will help you set up an affiliation agreement. I know Meridian, the one I went through, the program that you went through, they do have somebody that specifically handles that. And at least when I went through there, they did.
So that's interesting. You were going to work somewhere and you let them know that you were planning on doing this?
Exactly, yeah.
And the
I had come back from working overseas, and I was at a tipping point. Did I wanna become a paramedic with the idea of going back overseas working as a paramedic? Or did I wanna really take the leap and become a surgical first assistant, which I always wanted to do? And I decided that I'll do both at the same time. I figure I can do both at the same time. Yeah, that was a big mistake. I almost burnt myself out, but I did come to the
Mhm.
decision to drop the paramedic when I was in the paramedic clinicals and continue the pursuit with the surgical first assistant. And when I was there, I was moving from Florida to Virginia because I moved in with a family member so I could specifically live in Virginia and go to school at the same time. It would have been a little bit easier for me. And I know not everybody has that luxury where they can just up and move and do that. But I had to decide. There was another big first assistant school, another one of the oldest ones in the country, but they required a bachelor's degree and I didn't have
Mhm.
one and they were a little more expensive. But I figured I've already been a tech for 25 years. I might as well parlay that experience and use it to go through Meridian, which I did. And come to find out that they had Meridian students previously in that program. Their
Okay.
affiliation agreements were what's called evergreen, which means they stay in place until somebody cancels them, either Meridian or the hospital. So that was already in
Okay.
place. But if it's not, then you can set up affiliation agreement with the hospital you're working for. But then if they don't allow it, what other options are there? Kelly, do you know of any other option?
I'm glad you brought that up because that I like knowing the individual circumstance that you had. Mine was different. I
Mm,
worked in a hospital. I had been there 16 years working as a scrub tech. Now, I was not a CST. I did not go to CST school. I was trained on the job. I did live in Alabama at the time. They didn't require you to be certified to be a scrub tech. Agree or disagree, that's the way it was, and, so I was trained, fortunately, by an excellent, excellent CST. Um, she is my hero. She was such a great mentor. She herself was from Wisconsin, and she trained me so well, just fed into me so much knowledge from her CST training, so I almost feel like I did go to CST school, so that's how great her tutelage was. But I had been working in this facility for 16 years as a scrub tech, and even the caveat to that, John, is I was primarily in labor and delivery for that entire time. So not a very diverse background for me, and we can talk about that later,
mhm,
how that's not ideal, but it is doable. So if
mhm,
you have a desire to be a first assistant, don't limit yourself. If you have a strong desire to do it, you can do it. It did put me behind the 8 ball. I'll admit when I was in school and doing my labs with other scrubs that had been in the main OR and done a wide variety of cases, I felt, lacking. I was lacking in knowledge, of course. I mean, I was on a huge learning curve, but I was able to overcome that, thank goodness, and really get in and learn from my colleagues, and I asked questions and was able to learn from that. So, I was in this facility for 16 years, and when I decided to go to FA school, I did have to start from scratch and get that affiliation agreement. The school was great, had a great director and helped line that up for me, so we got the affiliation agreement in line between the hospital and the school, and then I had to approach surgeons to proctor me. So I had to ask those surgeons, "Hey, I'm gonna be doing this program. I need proctors." We didn't have Alabama is not a big first assistant state. I know some of the bigger hospitals in Birmingham use only RNFAs for whatever reason, and in South Alabama at USA, they use RNFAs, but they didn't really utilize first assistants. There are a couple of little pockets in Alabama that do have first assistants and utilize them, but it's not widespread. So I was in kind of a unique situation as well, where I was kind of in this little unique spot
Mhm.
here. So I had to go out and do the work myself and approach the surgeons. There was another first assistant in the main OR at the hospital where I worked. She was awesome, but even she was kind of under the radar. She was very knowledgeable and very experienced. She was a CST first and had become a first assistant. She kind of took me under her wing as well and taught me a lot. But I had to go downstairs to the main OR and just flat out cold introduce myself to general
Mhm.
surgeons and say, I'm Kelly Holland. I want to be a first assistant and I'm going to need you to proctor me, if you will. I had really helpful, good, experienced surgeons that kind of took me in and we got all that set up. Now, if you are not in that situation, first of all, oh, someone on one of our Facebook groups, I feel like recently was traveling as a CST and was gonna go to FA school and wondered, was there a way to do the clinical as a traveler? I don't know how that would work. So my advice when someone asks me that, my advice is to plant yourself,
Mm.
take a staff position somewhere, become staff, and then line all that up with your facility as far as getting those cases in. I don't know any other way to do it, frankly, and I feel like you're going to put yourself in a better position for being proctored and taught
Mm.
when you're somewhere with people that you work with on the daily.
Right.
Do you agree with
I
that?
totally agree
Mhm.
because, like I mentioned, I got a job at the hospital where I was working specifically with the idea that I would go to surgical first assistant school, do my clinicals there. But I
Mhm.
waited a year before I just didn't get a job right away and apply. I waited a year because I wanted to develop that relationship with the surgeons. I wanted them to get to know me
Right.
and see that I'm competent and interested in learning and I want to go further. And I got a preceptor agreement from every surgeon I worked with
Mhm.
because you have to have a certain number of cases in each specialty. So I wanted to make sure that
Right.
I had all those covered. I primarily did a lot of
Mhm.
orthopedics, so mine was kind of orthopedic heavy, but the program will tell you how your cases have to break down in whatever thing. But I thought you brought up a good point
Right.
as well, Kelly. Most people in the past got to surgical technology through a on the job training, and then
Mhm.
eventually there became more formal schools, and then they saw that there was money in it, so all these private schools, popped up charging what I think is a lot of money. I paid $1,200 in 1992 for my program. It was a
Right.
certificate only program. In 1992, as far as I know, at least where I was, there were only 2 tech programs in the state of Florida, and they were
Mhm.
both certificate programs. This associate thing didn't happen until later, so I think it sets you up to go further. I think an associate's degree is good. And I find that weird, Kelly, that they didn't have more surgical assistants in Alabama because University of Alabama, Birmingham is where it started. I mean,
I knew you were gonna bring that
yep,
up.
they
Yes,
did,
that's
and they
right.
had the first
Mhm.
surgeon's assistant program because I looked at it in 1980, and it was strictly a surgeon's assistant program like there are now.
Yeah.
Now it's a PA program, and I know
Mhm.
Meridian, excuse me, not Meridian, EVMS, I think started their program back in '76, so it's the second oldest. University of Alabama, Birmingham started theirs in 1967, and they
Mhm.
were using
Interesting. That's
non-surgeon first assistants, yeah, non-physician first assistants. It's really amazing. But yeah,
uh-huh.
so most people get there, and I've heard that too of people traveling. I think it's gonna be much more difficult because when you work at a facility, the surgeons have buy-in with you. They don't feel that
Mhm.
you're I don't mean this to sound mean or deprecating, but they don't think you're there as a thief to just take stuff and run. All most
Right.
surgeons love teaching. Most people in this profession love teaching
Mhm.
because that's how we got there.
Mhm.
We were taught. We love teaching. Most surgeons are receptive to being a preceptor for you, but you have to approach these surgeons with the idea that, okay, I want to get this guy to be a preceptor. And, so you do the best that you can for them if they see your skills and see you're interested in learning. But I think it's much more difficult to do it as a traveler. I don't think it's possible as a traveler because if you're
Yeah.
moving every 13 weeks, you're going to have to get new affiliation agreements. Now, they may be, like I said, they may be evergreen there. If you're just going to a different hospital every 13 weeks, I'll tell you right now, it's going to be difficult because it
It's an
has to be buy
investment.
in.
It's an investment. Yeah. It's an investment from the surgeon too, and
Mm.
it's important to remember that they are investing in you. It's taking their time and
Right.
energy and teaching you and slowing down and
Mhm.
helping you along the way, and I think it's just a natural human trait that they're not gonna wanna do that if you're gonna be gone in 3 months, you know?
Exactly.
They're gonna be less likely to want to do that, I should say. So, our advice, bottom line, our advice is plant yourself somewhere.
It's only a year.
Yeah, hang up the traveling shoes for a while, plant
Yep.
yourself somewhere, get established in a facility, and then move forward with your education, your first assisting education for sure.
Yeah, that's not the only way to do it, but that would be our suggestion.
Mhm,
It's only a year, you're gonna have to make sacrifices in your education.
mhm.
I changed my shifts from 8-hour shifts to 12-hour shifts, so
You
I'd
did
have more availability to do clinicals. Some hospitals, if you're lucky, will allow you to do your clinicals on the clock, some won't.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that
Yeah,
up, yeah.
there are many ways. Some hospitals are so desperate for first assistants, they will put you through first assistant school. I gotta admit, when
Yeah?
I got there to my surgical skills lab, I was a bit miffed because more than half of the people in my class had their flight paid for, had their hotel paid for, had their
I
school paid for, had everything paid for by the hospital,
same.
and I was paying all out of my own pocket, but
I know,
I
I
didn't
felt like chopped
care.
liver. I was like,
Yeah,
"What?
exactly. It's
There are
what I wanted
hospitals
to
that
do.
care about."
What I wanted to do, I was willing to make the sacrifice, but if you're in that spot and you're lucky enough to be in a situation like that, great, and take
Absolutely.
it and run with it.
That's a huge yep, that's a huge benefit, and I'm glad you brought that up as well because that's another thing to consider. You may have to I had to downgrade my employment status from full-time to PRN so that I could because my hospital wasn't doing they were not helping me at all
Mhm,
with on that end. They were great and obviously agreeing to the affiliation agreement, I'm sorry, and I had great surgeons, but as far as, oh, no, the facility encouraging me and no, there was none of that. So I had to
mhm,
decrease my employment status down to PRN, and I had to come up to that hospital and work on my days off to get those clinical cases, and I of course, I was willing to do it. I felt like that was part of the like you said, the sacrifice. I mean, it was like going to school. It was like working and going to school. So that's the way I looked at it. But I'm so glad you brought that up because that is another thing for people to consider that you may have to do. And you kind of
mhm,
have to evaluate that when you're looking at doing this. You've got to get those clinical cases in.
yes,
So if you're not in a situation where your facility is saying, hey, yeah, we're glad for you to count those cases on the clock, that's great. That's good and great, but consider that may not be the case. These are some things you need to check into
exactly.
before jumping in. Yeah.
Exactly, and talking with your director about that ahead of time will
Mhm.
definitely provide all those answers. Go to whoever your director is and say, "Listen, this is my plan. Can I do that here?" And, because you cannot be a scrub tech in a case and a student at the same time.
Correct. That's
That
correct.
may screw up their staffing profile, so they may or may not allow you to do that. And then I think you brought up another good point that people need to be prepared for. Not everybody's gonna be happy that you wanna become a first assistant.
Mhm.
You can find people can be hostile. And let me just say that was my experience. I thought I'd be welcomed with open arms when I decided to become a surgical first assistant. In fact, I remember telling the director, do me a favor, don't tell anybody that I want to go through the program. But unfortunately, she made an announcement in the morning meeting, and that's when the problem started. So it was
Wow.
actually a little more difficult for me because the hospital I had spent a year and a half working at developing all these relationships with surgeons who became proctors and precepts for me. Someone told me, "Nope, you can't do them here. You have to go to a satellite facility and do them where I didn't know anybody." But I
Wow.
did, and I did the same
Interesting.
thing
Yeah.
there that I did at the other places. I got the surgeons to come to know me and rely on me, and they allowed me to do it. And I eventually worked my way back into that hospital. But be prepared; not everybody's going to be excited that you want to do it. I was excited to
Right.
become one. People were flat out feeding me misinformation because at the time
Hmm.
Virginia was going to registration, but I didn't let that deter me. I wanted to become a first assistant, and I found out myself. I went and spoke to these people, and if you're in Virginia, you have quite a leg up than other states because there is a Virginia Association of Surgical Assistants. There was that resource, and they knew a little bit. And then the other organizations, ASA, NSAA, they knew more. So I went and asked those people, hey, what about registration? Can I do this? Can I do that? So there are
Hmm.
resources out there, and just ask, and we'll provide as much resource as we can for those people interested in going through
Right.
this program. But yep, like Kelly
Right.
said,
Right.
once you get your preceptor agreements, you do your clinical phase. After you've been released from your didactic phase, you do surgical skills assessment. Then usually the school says, yes, you can do your clinicals. So you can start your clinicals. And then
Right. So then, yeah, typically, so then you're doing your clinicals the same time you're finishing your academic work. So,
Yes, exactly. You
um,
do those
those kind of go
concomitantly. Yep.
together.
Yep. And
Yeah.
and I would say, at least for the program I went through, as soon as you start in the program, make the date for your surgical skills lab, because you can do that surgical
Mm.
skills lab at any time. You'll have to wait till you get to a certain point before you can start your clinicals, which is after that surgical skills lab. But if you those surgical skills lab fill up. So I was lucky. I almost missed the last one of the year, but I was able to get in.
Right.
That's
And
program specifics.
right, that is program specific, and, that would be an important question to ask your director or whoever your advisor is at your program, like, how quick do these fill up? I mean, how
Exactly.
you know, that would be a great question to ask. That's a good point, John.
And that's I think it's gonna be a
Um,
benefit to have some of these program directors of these programs on to talk about that, because they can give you
yeah,
those little hints on, if you're gonna do our program, make sure you do this, this, and this. So I think it's definitely something we should pursue and have those on.
right,
So
right. So, obviously, when you've, met all the requirements for school and you've gotten all those clinical cases in and you've finished your academics, you've completed all that, and you're ready to sit for your exam, and you go and take that exam, um and you pass, hopefully. I don't know about you, John, but I had to wait. The test that we took should have told us immediately if we passed. I should have gotten the pass or fail, thumbs up or thumbs down upon leaving the exam center. But there had been a glitch in communication from my school so that they didn't have quite proof that I had actually finished the program. I don't know how that worked, but anyway, the point is, I left the center not knowing if I had passed or failed. Well, I knew I had failed. It was just very hard exam for me.
mm,
It was very difficult. I had studied and studied and studied and, we all have that story. And I had to go to work the next day and I was at work and just I was coming up with plan B and what I
mhm,
was gonna do instead, which listen, no shame in not passing the thing the first time. Hey, it's a hard exam.
mhm.
And I've worked with nurses before that took their boards and didn't pass and had to do work as a tech until they took their boards again. It happened. But I had to work like almost an entire shift at work and finally found out that evening that I got an email that said you passed. And so I was so happy, so relieved. Um, but yeah, once you pass, if you've got a good story to tell about yours, tell it about
Mine was
finding
the
out
same
you got
experience
there.
as yours. Mine, I think at the time, and it might be that way still, you have to go to a testing center. I had to go to Pearson VUE
Yes.
Testing Center. You do the computer with a
Mhm.
proctor, you do it on the computer,
Yeah.
and then I think
Right.
it's an adaptive at the time, it was an adaptive exam, which means if you got a certain number of questions right, then it stopped the test and you were done. And mine stopped, and I'm like, "Oh my god. I either passed it really well or I failed it really bad." And the same thing,
Right.
mine was right around Christmas, I believe, so the school was a little bit behind in getting the information to the testing center, so I had to wait
Mhm.
an agonizing 2 weeks to get my results.
Oh
Yeah,
my
and it
gosh, that's
was
way worse than 24
yeah, oh my
hours.
god, yeah, and I was like, "Oh my god, did I have to take it again?" And there's no shame in that. Some people are bad test takers. I'm
I'm
not a
not a
good
good
test
test
taker. I
taker.
read too much
I'm not
into the
either.
exam, and I had to make sure
Me too.
I used every minute of that test because I reread the questions before I answered them, because sometimes I read too fast. I made sure I took my time. I was gonna use every second they gave me. I believe it was 3.5 hours.
Mhm.
I was
Yep.
gonna use every second. And there are some people, I've seen them in the forums, that have taken the test 2 and 3 times because they get really nervous and they forget everything. Maybe we can do an episode on that in the future on taking the exam. But if you're good at FOIL
Yeah.
analysis, you can pass this test. So
Right.
we'll go
Right.
into that.
But you take your exam, you pass it, you become certified. So now you're a first assistant. Now what? The first thing I want to say to this is if you have been working as a scrub tech at a facility and you went through the first assist program, whether your facility put you through it or not. Now, I shouldn't say that because if your facility said, "We need first assistants, we're going to pay your way, we're gonna support you through first assisting school," that's likely came with the exchange of, yeah, contract. So we expect you to work for us for 2 years or whatever it is. So I'm not talking to that person. If you made that agreement and said, "Yes, I need the financial support. If you will pay for me to go through this school, I will agree to work here as a first assistant for 2 years." You're on the road. You've actually are in a fantastic place. If they're going to utilize you as a first assistant, I'm assuming they will if they needed first assistants bad enough that they did that and have that program. you're just gonna gain experience, right?
Mhm.
For that 1 or 2 years, you're gonna gain needed, basic bread and butter experience, hopefully. And if you get into more complicated cases and you're doing high acuity cases at your facility, even better, even better. I tell people straight up, you have got to get experience somewhere. And most people need to start with the general cases just and build your way up. I do want to speak to the person that's been a scrub tech at a facility for a while and you've worked there and you made the decision to go to FA school and become a first assistant. Um, it can be hard, and I know this just from hearing from other people on it. It can be difficult to transition, to make that transition from being a scrub into a first assistant. We don't want to get too hung up on this episode
Right.
because we're going to kind of take a deeper dive, I think, later on. I do want to say that it may be worth considering toward the end of your FA education or at the very beginning when you're just getting out of school with that certification. It may be worth considering looking at going to another facility if you have that option and jumping in where people don't know you and don't know you as the CST title, because I feel like a lot of facilities will pigeonhole you. No fault of anybody. Sometimes it's just the most convenient thing to do. They know you're an awesome scrub tech. They need scrub techs. They're going to keep utilizing you in that role naturally as it fits the needs of that operating room. And many times that is the case.
Mhm.
So what I'm basically saying there is just consider the fact that you may need to look for employment elsewhere
Mm.
when finishing that. Would you agree with that, John?
I totally agree with that. When I meet people, if I'm traveling and they're going through the whatever program they're going through to become a first assistant, I tell them, "Hey, listen, once you're done certified, and if it's in a state that requires licensure, that you have your license, that you just want to move to a different hospital. It's just
Mhm.
the way it is. It's human nature. They relied
It
on you for
is.
so long, and you're very
Mhm.
reliable and dependable, which is most surgical assistants are. They're gonna come to I've seen it happen over and over and over again. I was lucky that there wasn't a position for me, so I had to leave and go to a different facility, but I've seen it happen. "Listen, I know you're a first assistant now, but we're really short scrub techs, so would you mind scrubbing that case?" And that's
Right.
a personal decision. Everybody has to make that decision, but for me, I was a tech for 25 years, and I was done with it. I didn't wanna be a tech
Mhm.
anymore, and it's a very important role. We cannot do surgery without you.
Absolutely.
I mean, surgical techs is a very important role. And this kind of question, and we'll go into this probably in the next episode, become a surgical
Yes.
assistant. Now what? Do you leave the Mayo stand behind? I think it's important that you do, but it's everybody's personal decision whether they want to do that or not. But it's highly recommended that you go somewhere where they only know you as a first assistant.
Mhm.
And if you want to help out in scrub cases, that's up to you. But we've moved forward. We've gotten more education for a reason. Let's step into the professional role that we've become and move on from there. But yeah, I think
Right.
that's
And
good
it's
advice.
okay when you're yeah, and when you're, looking at that fresh job as a first assistant, and not as a scrub tech, it's okay that you're fresh out of school. It's
Mhm.
okay to be green. The
Right.
important thing I feel like in that interview, when you're interviewing, is to show that,
Yep.
excitement and to show you're ready to jump in. You've gotten your fundamentals, you've gotten that education, you've got your solid background in the operating room, you know the fundamentals, and how excited you are to step off into this next phase of your career. We all have to start
Mhm.
green. I had to go sit in front of a vascular surgeon and a director of a medical clinic in my interview straight out of first assistant school. Had never laid eyes on a vascular case, guys. I had never done a vascular
Oh, wow.
case, but it did not matter because I interviewed and I just was very optimistic and upbeat and said, "I can learn it. I know I can learn it. I can do this." And had the fantastic opportunity to go work with a vascular surgeon for 2 years and learned so much I can't even begin to say, but my point is it's okay to be
Mhm.
green. It's okay to be inexperienced. You can do it, and you have the opportunity out of FA school and after getting that certification, John, right, to go work for a surgical group. You can go interview at another hospital operating room. You can go interview at a surgical center. So you've got options, and don't be embarrassed or ashamed that you don't have any real surgical assisting. They know that you're fresh out of school, and I feel like when you project that in that interview, they're going to pick up on it and you'll have success.
I agree with you, and it's okay to be brand new. What I think is important is that you, like Kelly mentioned, show your enthusiasm to learn. But you can say, "Well,
Mhm.
yes, I don't have a lot of experience at this, but I am willing to learn. I'm a quick learner. I dedicate myself to learning something when I want to learn something." And I always say, if it's a situation like that with me, that I don't come with a lot of bad habits, so I'm a blank slate. You can teach me how
Oh,
you
that's
want me to
good.
be. I can fit a role that you need because you can mold me into that role. I don't come with a lot of bad habits, which,
That's a very good selling point, yes.
people that have been doing it for a while, they have their own practice, the way they do things. Not that they can't change, but they come already trained. But somebody that's brand new, if I have somebody that's brand new and has enthusiasm and wants to learn, then I know I can work with that. So that's
Mhm.
good.
It's been fun talking about this and encouraging. I hope this was encouraging and gave people some insight and some information that they needed. I sure do.
Yeah, I think so. I think it did.
Yeah, we're gonna talk about that. That's a hot topic,
It is. It's
actually.
a
It's
real
a good hot
topic.
topic, and that's coming up. So that's a little teaser there that John just gave. So we are gonna be talking about leaving the Mayo stand behind, and once you're established in first assisting, does scrubbing ever come back into that? So we're gonna leave that there and talk about that in the future for sure. But thanks for joining us, everyone. We appreciate you listening. Again, we hope this was helpful to you today. And scan our other episodes that are up. See if there's anything else there that looks you'd want to listen. We're excited to be here and look forward to a future time with you.
Yes, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thanks for listening today. We invite you to like and subscribe to this channel and leave a comment if you'd like. Feel free to look us up on Facebook at the Surgical Assistant Podcast or email us at thesurgicalassistantpodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, content of this podcast is in no way intended for diagnosing or treating surgical conditions. No patient-specific information is shared, and all HIPAA guidelines will be adhered to.